Now, St. Thomas lived in the 13th century from about 1225 to 1274. So when you consider how young a man he was when he died, his corpus of work becomes all the more impressive. How could you possibly have done this? How could you have possibly done it? It calls to mind the statement by St. Isidore of Seville, who once said that anyone who tells you that he's read everything Augustine has written must be a liar. Well, in a way, you almost feel that way about St. Thomas, anyone who's read it all and really, truly absorbed everything. Well, St. Thomas was convinced, as were the typical run of scholastics in his day, that faith and reason could not contradict each other. And St. Thomas believed that our knowledge consisted of three different kinds. For instance, he argued that some of our knowledge we know through divine revelation alone. Some knowledge we know both through divine revelation and through human reason, and still other kinds of knowledge are known through reason alone. So, for example, one piece of information that we have that we know through divine revelation alone would be that God is a Trinity, that He's one God in three divine persons. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas said that this is something we have to know through divine revelation because human reason could never arrive at this conclusion. This is an astonishing mystery. We could never arrive at this conclusion. Now, if I may digress for a moment, I'll point out that some thinkers have tried to claim that human reason can also prove the Trinity. The argument is that if we know that God is love, and we're going to make that something other than just a bumper sticker slogan, God is love, we're really going to take it seriously, then God has to have a threefold nature. Because if He is love, that means we have to have within God the two who love, because love exists between two parties, and then love is fruitful. So there has to be a third party, in effect. There has to be the fruits of that love. That's why some theologians have sometimes pointed to the family, the human family of husband, wife, and child, as in fact imaging the Trinity, as a mirror into the divine economy. Economy, of course, in its Greek root, meaning household. Because, in effect, the husband and wife love each other, and the fruit of that love is their child. Well, that's neither here nor there, because the consensus is that the Trinity is not something that we can arrive at through strict proof. So that would fall under St. Thomas's first category. The second category, things we can know through divine revelation and through reason, would include, for example, some aspects of the moral law. I suppose reflecting on the subject of murder, just simply reflecting on it honestly, using your mind, you can probably arrive at the conclusion that murder is something people ought not to do. That even if God had never said anything about murder, you could probably draw that as a safe conclusion. Now, God has, of course, told us that we may not commit murder. And St. Thomas answered the question that you might ask, why would God tell us something that we could just figure out on our own using human reason? And one of St. Thomas's, I think, pretty good arguments in response to that is, the reason he does it is to make our lives a little easier. Because not everybody is a philosopher or has time to sit around 24 hours a day trying to deduce everything in the world through human reason. So God helps us. He tells us things that, yes, we could figure out on our own, but, well, some of us are too busy or blockheaded to do so, basically. The third area of knowledge is knowledge that is known through reason alone. And an example of that would be what causes rainbows. There's nothing in sacred scripture that explains to us what causes rainbows, and there's nothing in sacred tradition that explains it either. That we understand through the rigorous pursuit of reason. Well, now, getting back to St. Thomas, he poses the question whether God exists. Now, as I said, St. Thomas always anticipates his opponent's arguments, and he anticipates all of them. He even comes up with arguments they haven't thought of. So it's very revealing that when St. Thomas is trying to think of all the arguments against the existence of God, how many does he come up with? Only two. One of them is the existence of evil, and the other one is that the universe seems to run itself. It's like we don't need a God. It would be superfluous to posit the existence of a God. And in some ways, these are very much the same arguments that are still with us today. Well, here's one of St. Thomas's proofs, and I'm sort of adapting it for modern use. But let's begin as follows. Let's suppose you're in the deli, in the supermarket. You want to go up to the deli counter and get some turkey. You go up there, though, and you find that you have to take a number before you can get to the counter and get your turkey. So just as you're about to take your number, you see another device. And this other device says, well, before you can take a number, you have to take a number to get in line to take a number. Well, this is a very disturbing, Kafka-esque deli, to be sure. So you're about to take that number, and it turns out there's another number machine. It says, whoa, 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 not so fast. Before you take that number, you have to take a number. Before you take that number, you have to take a number. So you have to take a number to get in line to take a number, to get in line to take a number, to get to the deli counter. Well, suppose you turn your head and you see that going on infinitely down this supermarket is an infinite series of numbers you have to take. Well, are you ever going to get to the deli counter? Of course not. You'll spend the rest of your miserable, rotten life standing there trying to take numbers, but being unable to do so because there's always a preceding one you have to take. You can never even take a number because there's always one before it that you are supposed to take first. You'll never get to the deli counter, that's for sure. But suppose you're wandering around all frustrated in the supermarket, you're wandering around, and you see somebody with turkey in the shopping cart. Then you know the numbers must not go on forever, because then how did this person get the turkey? There must have been a stopping point somewhere. Or consider this. You want to sign up for a course at a college, a special course, and you're told, well, if you want to sign up for that course, you have to go see Mr. Jones. You go see Mr. Jones, and he says, oh, sorry, before you can see me, you've got to see Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown says, before you can see me, you've got to see Mr. Johnson. You say to yourself, what in the world? Obviously, I don't need to take this course. It's going to drive me insane. You'll obviously never get in there because there's always somebody earlier you have to get permission from before you can do it. But suppose you see somebody enrolled in that course, then you know there must not be an infinite sequence of people you need to get permission from, because then how did this person get in there? Now, what does this have to do with the existence of God? We have a basic insight as human beings that every effect has a cause. Nothing just exists on its own. Nobody goes down to the beach and says, oh, this sandcastle must have just been randomly created by the movement of the waves, or it existed from all time, or my watch here. Nobody would look at this watch and say, oh, I bet this has just always been there before the beginning of time. No one would say that. Okay, we know that would be nonsense. Or, and I apologize to whoever it is I'm borrowing this from. I can't remember what your name is, but I like this example. Suppose I walk into my office and there's a bowling ball on my chair. Now, there are many possible ways it could have gotten there, but the one explanation I will not accept is, well, it just appeared. It had no cause. No one would accept that, right? I would be willing to consider the most ridiculous explanations before I would accept that. In fact, I'd be willing to consider the possibility that the CIA is trying to spy on me, and they've put a little chip in this bowling ball to make that possible. I would consider that before I would consider the ball just appeared. Well, now here's St. Thomas's proof. Every effect requires a cause. So consider anything existing. It requires a cause. Consider a thing Z. It requires a cause. We'll call the cause of Z Y. But the problem is, Y requires a cause too, right? Y doesn't just exist out of nowhere. Y also has to be caused. Well, what caused Y? Well, we'll say X caused Y. But then we're back to the same problem. What caused X? X isn't just self-existing. Every effect requires a cause. So what caused X? Let's see. W. Okay, I guess you can probably see where I'm going with this. W caused X. And then we keep on going because that doesn't solve the problem either. Because then what caused W? So what St. Thomas is saying is, suppose you have an infinite series of causes in which Z is caused by Y, but Y is caused by X. X is caused by W. W is caused by V, and this just goes on forever. If that were true, then nothing would exist. Nothing would exist because before anything could exist, it would be awaiting a cause for its existence. But that cause doesn't yet exist because it requires a cause. And that cause doesn't yet exist because it's awaiting a cause. If everything is always awaiting a previously existing cause, the sequence of causes could never get started. It would be like waiting to try to get turkey at that hideous deli. It just goes on forever. You can never get it started. You can never get that number to get started. It just goes on forever. You'd never get any turkey. And in this case, nothing would exist in the world. But look around you. Things do exist. Okay? Things do exist. The TV you're watching this on exists. All these things do exist. So the series of causes cannot logically go on forever. There must be a stopping point. There must be something that exists entirely outside the causal sequence that gets this relationship going, that begins to cause the next thing, which causes the next thing, which brings all the things we see into existence. And St. Thomas says, this cause must be God. Now, some people will say, well, then what caused God? Well, that actually shows a complete misunderstanding of the argument. The point is simply that it is logically necessary, it's unavoidably necessary, that something must exist outside this causal sequence in order to get it going. Now, I don't think that's a dumb guy argument, right? I find that an overwhelmingly persuasive argument. And I used to explain it to my students when I taught history in New York and I taught Western Civ. I used to do this. It's a legitimate historical point. And it makes you think. Now, you don't reason yourself, typically, into believing in God. But there are a lot of people today, I think, who think that believing in God is just stupid and irrational. Proofs like this can help to break down those barriers for people like that.